cowboy is a symbol of the American West. It has its roots that stretch all the way back to ancient times and across continents, combining traditions from northern Mexico, vaqueros, and European culture, specifically Spanish influence. This blend started all the way back in the 16th century when Spanish conquistadors brought their cattle ranching practices along with horses and cattle to the Americas. See, at that time, horses had become extinct in the Americas. This radically changed the landscape and set the stage for cowboy culture to cultivate. These early horseback cattle herders adapted to the vast lands and sparse grasslands in what is now today Mexico and the southern United States. The term cowboy is, of course, rooted in Spanish culture. Originally, cowboy came from the word vaquero in Spanish, which translates to someone who handles cattle while riding a horse. The word vaquero itself is derived from vaca, which means cow, stemming from the Latin word vaca. Interestingly enough, English language had its own term for a cowboy. It was called a cowherd and was used to describe a cattle herder akin to a shepherd for sheep. And this dates back to at least the year 1000. Regardless, by the 1700s, the term cowboy had appeared in English literature. It first appeared being used by Jonathan Swift in 1725. However, the term was more commonly used between the 1820s and the 1850s in the British Isles, not referring to a person who was skilled on horseback like we know today, but young boys that were tasked with tending to family or community cows. By the year 1849, the term cowboy started to become popular, and not everyone was quick to use it. Many still like to call themselves cowhands, drovers, stockmen, but they all meant the same thing: a person who handled cattle. As stories and legends of the American West began to spread, new versions of cowboys popped up, like a cowpoke. Cowpoke was originally used for someone who helped move cattle into trains. Despite these new terms, cowboy continued to be widely used, especially in the vast areas of the American Plains and the Rocky Mountains. Interestingly enough, the cowboy legend was not simply limited to men. A few women embraced the lifestyle, and this led to the inclusion of the term cowgirl into the narrative. This job was initially taken up by young adults who often started as early as in their teens and were the primary participants in this very demanding way of life. These young cowboys came in a diverse mixture of American freedmen, Mexicans, and white settlers from various parts of the United States. They all shared in this high-risk, low-paying work that was integral to cattle ranching across the vast American landscape. Despite their diverse backgrounds, a collective cowboy image would start to emerge, built on the trials and tribulations of their work and the camaraderie that they fostered. This shared experience, along with the necessary skills for cattle ranching and the mobile freedom provided by horseback riding, contributed to the enduring legacy of cowboys in America. But in the context of African Americans, they began to work as cowboys as far back as the colonial period. The first proof that we see of black cowboys comes from South Carolina, where enslaved individuals skilled in managing cows were brought here from Senegal specifically for their cattle ranching abilities. In the early 19th century, white Americans started to move into Texas. They were attracted by cheap land and, in some cases, to escape debt in the United States. Even though Mexico had outlawed slavery at the time, these new settlers brought their slaves to work with them on their cotton farms and their cattle ranches. By 1825, enslaved people made up 25% of the settlers in Texas, a number that would increase to 30% by 1860, with that year's census recording 180,000 enslaved people in the Texas area. During this time, majority of the cowboys were African American. These individuals were tasked with catching and taking care of the wild cattle in the thick forests of the Gulf Coast. These black cowboys would often work with vaqueros and would move large groups of cattle guided by oxen and followed by dogs. When Texas joined the Confederacy in 1861, many of the white Texans enlisted in the fight, leaving their enslaved to take care of their land and the livestock. However, Texas ranchers encountered several problems. One of their major issues was a lack of effective fencing. This resulted in cattle wandering freely without restriction. When the ranchers returned from the war, they tried to gather these scattered herds with the help of their enslaved, but the Emancipation Proclamation soon freed the enslaved workers, leaving the ranchers without their traditional workforce. Consequently, former enslaved individuals didn't have many jobs available to them, so many of them decided to work for the same ranchers that had previously enslaved them. This period coincided with the surge of cattle drives in the northern states, where beef commanded higher prices, and these large-scale operations involved moving massive herds of cattle through treacherous territories and underscored the indispensable role of African American cowboys. While on the trail, the social dynamics were surprisingly agrarian. White and black cowboys often shared sleeping quarters and resources such as blankets, blurring the racial lines that would rigidly define normal social norms. However, this suspension of racial social hierarchy was promptly reverted back with the presence of white women, highlighting the conditional nature of racial equality in these groups and in America in general. The compensation for black trail hands was modest. You could typically get a little bit more money in the northern destinations, and the pay varied across different runs and among individuals within that run, with evidence of Mexican cowhands being paid significantly less than white counterparts. However, oddly enough, data does not clearly indicate that black cowboys were systematically paid less than their white counterparts for equivalent work. Nonetheless, black cowboys often faced harsher working conditions and were expected to undertake additional labor that was not asked upon their white counterparts, such as doing laundry, testing the stream water, and managing difficult horses. Despite the existence of all black trail crews, African American cowboys seldom ascended beyond the role of trail cook or chuck wagon leader. Opportunities for leadership were constrained by the necessity of engaging with white men who would not respect a black man's authority. This ceiling forced many talented African American cowboys to train their white peers, who would then venture out and own and manage their own cattle. The journey on the trail posed its own set of challenges for social interaction. While saloons were somewhat neutral ground for racial interactions, restaurants maintained a strict segregation policy, often relegating black patrons to the back door. In situations where exclusively black establishments were unavailable, black cowboys had to procure their food independently and prepare it themselves. Furthermore, black men were outright banned from brothels, although gambling halls were okay. And this illustrated the complex and often contradictory nature of racial integration during this time period. As the 1800s came to a close, the world of the cowboy began to change significantly. Railroads expanded across the country, making it easier to transport cattle and reducing the need for long cattle drives. The invention of barbed wire in the 1880s played a huge role. It allowed ranchers to fence off their land, and this meant that cows could be kept in specific areas to avoid overgrazing. It also meant that there was less open land for cattle to roam, marking the end of the open range era. A particularly rough winter in 1886 and 1887 saw many cattle die from starvation in the Northwest due to overgrazing and a lack of winter food, causing the cattle industry to crash. By the 1890s, barbed wire fencing was now common in the northern plains, and meatpacking plants were built closer to ranching areas, and the era of the epic cattle drive from Texas to Kansas was simply a thing of the past. During this period, black cowboys, who had always played a crucial role in the cowboys' workforce, saw themselves facing narrower and narrower job opportunities. In the early days, they made up a significant portion of cowboys, but by the 1890s in Texas, they represented just 3% of all cowboys, and overall, they represented just 2% of the cowboys in the American West. As this cowboy life was changing, many simply found work in other industries. Despite this decline in the traditional cowboy role, the fascination with cowboys did not wane in the American public. The public still loved the idea of the Wild West, leading to Wild West shows, rodeos, and dime novels. This interest illustrated the spirit of cowboys was still alive, even though the actual lifestyle became less and less common. While big cattle drives had ended, cowboy work was more settled and less frequent. The image of the cowboy continued to capture Americans' imagination, and that imagination painted a romanticized and somewhat fictional depiction of the American West and often overlooked some of the harsher realities of frontier life. As the tale of the Old West began to quickly shift from dime novels to movies and television shows such as Stagecoach, which was released in 1939 and portrayed cowboys as heroes of the Old West and enthralling tales of good versus evil. However, these Hollywood movies and TV shows refused to represent black men in heroic cowboy roles. Even though there was a reality of African-American cowboys such as Nat Love and Bass Reeves and Bill Pickett, their contributions and experiences were largely ignored and forgotten. As a result, the image of the American cowboy that many people think of today is largely based off whitewashed film and TV shows that ignored the role that black cowboys played. These shows ignored the fact that black cowboys played an important role in our country's history. Today, modern historians, filmmakers, novelists, and black heritage groups sought to remedy this forgotten history of the black cowboy. Groups like the Oakland Black Cowboy Association, the New York City Federation of Black Cowboys, Philadelphia Fetcher Street Urban Club, and the Compton Cowboys work hard to showcase and continue the legacy of black cowboys as a larger part of American heritage and the role that they play in our country's history.